What if the most terrifying orders in history were never written, never recorded, and never spoken outside a locked chamber, yet shaped the fate of an entire empire? For centuries, the official portrait of this Eastern Empress presents her as a symbol of serenity, a refined mother of the nation, a protector of temples and tradition. But beneath those carefully crafted titles lies a trail of silenced witnesses, erased chronicles, and decisions whispered so quietly that only their consequences survived. The deeper you go into her story, the more you realize that the truth was never meant to reach us. In the vast courts of the East, power wasn't supposed to move through fear. It moved through ritual, diplomacy, and perfectly archived decrees. But that was only the world people were allowed to see. Hidden inside the inner palace, beyond layers of silk screens and ceremonial gates, the Empress cultivated a second world, a world where information became a weapon sharper than any blade, and where a single private instruction could alter the destiny of entire bloodlines. The contradiction between her public virtue and her secret authority was so absolute that historians still struggle to reconcile the two pieces. Imagine an imperial palace where every corridor is polished to mirror the illusion of harmony, yet every shadow hides a pair of listening ears. Servants who appeared harmless carried fragments of conversations from room to room. Eunuchs, often dismissed as powerless, became silent bridges between the Empress and her most delicate operations. And the women closest to her, ladies-in-waiting, attendants, ritual performers, formed a network nearly impossible to trace. Their names rarely entered the records, making their actions perfect ghosts in the historical archive. Early signs of the Empress's hidden orders appear only as patterns, never as explicit evidence. A minister collapses mysteriously after questioning the palace's expenses. A concubine favored by a rival faction dies of an unexplained fever. A provincial governor who resisted new reforms is summoned to the capital and vanishes between two checkpoints. To the outside world, these were coincidences, tragedies, misfortunes. But in the fragile balance of court politics, too many coincidences form a signal, and too many silences point to a single source. What makes her story truly unsettling is how effortlessly she used her gentle reputation as a shield. The more harmless she appeared in public, the easier it became for her to issue secret commands without suspicion. Foreign diplomats wrote about her grace, poets praised her generosity, monks compared her to celestial beings. All of this created the perfect smokescreen, allowing her to operate unseen while everyone assumed she was incapable of cruelty. That duality, the mask and the shadow, is where the frightening truth begins to surface. And as you hear this, ask yourself something uncomfortable. How much of what you believe about historical figures comes from what you were meant to believe? How many stories were shaped by the winners, the scribes, the censors, the loyalists? If this Empress managed to bury so much, imagine what else slipped through the cracks of time. Share what this question stirs in you in the comments. Leave a like if this kind of hidden history deserves to be uncovered. And take a second to check if you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Because the deeper we go, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The empire she inherited was not the serene landscape painted in court poetry. It was a territory trembling beneath the weight of rebellions, factional disputes, and regional governors who treated their provinces like personal kingdoms. Inside the capital, rival clans maneuvered for influence behind silk curtains, each convinced they had the right to replace her with someone more manageable. Even the sacred institutions, the temples that were supposed to remain neutral, became battlegrounds where priests aligned themselves with powerful families instead of divine order. This volatile mixture created a pressure that would have shattered most rulers long before they ever touched the throne. For the Empress, every public ceremony carried a hidden threat. Every bow from a minister concealed calculations. Every tribute from a regional lord could be a disguised warning. The empire outwardly appeared unified, but beneath the polished rituals, fractures spread like cracks under marble. Foreign envoys reported strange inconsistencies. One month, the court seemed harmonious. The next, soldiers quietly fortified the city gates. Such fluctuations were not random. They were the pulse of an empire trying to hold itself together with silk threads, while internal storms brewed just out of sight. As tension escalated, the Empress learned that traditional leadership would not save her. Diplomacy had its limits. Mercy had a price. Trust had become a luxury she could not afford. In the chaos of a collapsing political structure, even hesitation could be lethal. Whenever a faction sensed weakness, they acted without mercy, pushing propaganda, buying allegiances, bribing military officers, and spreading rumors through markets and taverns. In that environment, a ruler who waited for proof before acting was already defeated. For her, survival required moving faster than threats could reveal themselves. The constant pressure shaped her mind into something far sharper than anyone at court expected. Instead of allowing fear to paralyze her, she began to read danger as a signal. A minister hesitating during an audience, a noblewoman declining a ceremonial invitation, a sudden increase in temple donations from a rival clan. Each detail became a clue, a piece of a larger pattern that only she seemed able to see. The more she observed, the more she understood that the empire wasn't just unstable, it was actively conspiring against itself. Even the palace, supposedly the safest place in the empire, became a labyrinth of suspicion. Servants aligned with powerful families tried to gather information. Eunuchs loyal to old dynasties whispered about restoring past rulers. Guards shifted allegiances depending on who offered the most gold. In this environment, the Empress realized that danger didn't announce itself with armies or banners. It came softly, disguised as politeness, loyalty, tradition. The people closest to her were often the ones with the most to gain from her downfall. The atmosphere reached a point where even silence carried meaning. A sudden drop in reports from a province, a letter arriving later than expected, a ritual performed with an unusual variation. She learned to read absence as fluently as presence, and with each new signal, she felt the window of safety narrowing. In such a climate, the secret orders she would soon issue were not born from cruelty alone, but from a conviction that the empire was one wrong move away from breaking entirely. She understood that if she wanted to survive the storm, she would have to shape it first, before it swallowed her whole. If the empire itself was becoming a storm, the court around the Empress was the lightning hidden inside it. Every figure who stood near her claimed loyalty, but their eyes told a different story. The ministers seated at her council table had survived too many reigns to be trusted. Generals returned from campaigns with victories that felt too perfectly timed, as if designed to strengthen their own legend instead of the throne. Even within the inner palace, the circle of women around her was anything but harmless. Some were placed there by rival clans, others by religious authorities, and a few came with ambitions so quietly sharpened that their smiles felt like blades wrapped in silk. The Empress learned early that concubines were not simply ornaments of the court. Many were political instruments trained to influence, mislead, or overhear secrets from the deepest chambers. One concubine became known for her uncanny ability to predict shifts in alliances, something no one should have known with such precision. Another, gifted with poetry, shared verses that carried double meanings aimed at undermining the Empress's authority in coded whispers. Even the elderly dowager who pretended to be fragile had enough influence to sway half the palace if she chose to act. Each woman represented a potential opening for her enemies, a quiet doorway through which treachery could slip unnoticed. But it wasn't only women who surrounded her with hidden motives. eunuchs wielded an underestimated power: access. They controlled the flow of documents, schedules, and audiences. A single missing report, a slightly altered message, an intercepted petition could shift the political landscape in subtle ways no one would detect until it was too late. Some of them built private alliances with wealthy families outside the palace, selling information or manipulating events for personal gain. Others had loyalties that stretched back decades, tied not to the empress but to former rulers or ambitious princes waiting for a chance to reclaim relevance. Foreign envoys added another layer of danger, arriving with polished smiles and encoded agendas. Their gifts held symbolic messages. Their letters concealed warnings. Their conversations danced around topics designed to expose weaknesses in the imperial structure. Several of them returned to their homelands with conflicting descriptions of the empress. Some called her brilliant, others called her unstable, and a few suggested she was dangerously unreadable. For a ruler surrounded by enemies, being unreadable was both a shield and a curse. The empress processed all of this with a clarity that unnerved those who underestimated her. She had grown up watching court theatrics, absorbing every glance, gesture, and pause. By the time she ascended to power, she no longer viewed her environment as a collection of individuals. She saw it as a living organism composed of alliances, resentments, whispered conspiracies, and subtle power plays. Her understanding of human behavior became her greatest defense. She noticed how rival factions avoided standing too close to one another during ceremonies. She observed which minister always touched his sleeve before lying. She memorized the rhythm of the palace so thoroughly that even the smallest irregularity felt like an alarm. Yet this knowledge came with a growing realization. The threats around her were not isolated. They were interconnected in ways that suggested something more coordinated, more deliberate. A single ally turning distant might be coincidence. 3 in the same week meant something was moving beneath the surface. Even the temple astrologers began delivering vague predictions about shifting destinies and hidden transformations, warnings that echoed too closely the political instability rising outside her chambers. The empress understood then that the forces aligned against her were preparing to strike, not through open rebellion, but through subtle erosion of her authority. Every smile, every bow, every polite word carried the weight of potential betrayal. It was in this suffocating atmosphere, surrounded by friendly enemies and hostile allies, that she began to consider actions she had once thought unthinkable. The palace was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield disguised with incense and silk. And if she wanted to stay alive long enough to protect the empire, she would have to identify which threat demanded her first move. The moment she realized she needed to act first came not through a dramatic incident, but through a quiet, almost invisible shift. A scribe who had worked faithfully for years suddenly requested reassignment to a remote archive. A guard known for his unwavering loyalty began avoiding eye contact during inspections. Even a musician who regularly played at court ceremonies abruptly stopped attending rehearsals. Individually, none of these changes meant anything. Together, they formed a pattern that felt orchestrated. Something was spreading through the palace: anxiety, hesitation, perhaps fear, and it all seemed connected to a select group of people who had access to information no one else should have known. It started with a single night when reports from 3 different provinces arrived with identical phrasing, as if crafted by the same hand. The empress immediately sensed manipulation. No messenger would risk punishment by forging imperial reports. Such uniformity had to be deliberate, controlled, designed to mislead. She summoned discreet inquiries, not formal ones that would alert the council. The quiet investigation revealed something far worse. Individuals close to the throne had been exchanging private messages using a coded language hidden within traditional court poetry. These Messages referenced meetings, negotiations, and potential shifts in power that excluded her entirely. The Empress understood then that information was slipping away from her grip. Those who knew too much, or who thought they did, could become dangerous faster than any army. She could not confront them publicly. Doing so would expose her vulnerability and confirm to her enemies that she feared losing control. Instead, she chose a path that could not be traced, a whispered order to ensure that certain individuals stopped speaking entirely. Not through spectacle, but through absence. A scribe falls ill on a journey. A guard quietly retires and never returns home. A musician is invited to perform in a distant temple and disappears before reaching it. Each event could be explained if questioned, yet the timing revealed the truth to anyone observant enough to see it. Her most trusted attendants carried out the instructions with precision. They were women whose names history ignored. Shadows trained to move unnoticed through the palace. One delivered a sealed herbal remedy to a scribe who had been growing restless. Another redirected a routine escort so that a guard traveled alone at night. A third convinced a musician to accept a last-minute invitation. The brilliance of these maneuvers was not their brutality, but their subtlety. Nothing appeared violent. Nothing seemed intentional. And yet the effect was unmistakable. The flow of sensitive information slowed until it became a trickle. Still, the Empress noticed one disquieting consequence. Silence did not erase danger. It only covered it. Those who remained began sensing that something invisible was happening. Conversations ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned. Ministers spoke more cautiously. Even the servants whispered about an unseen force tightening around the court. The Empress realized that the first set of disappearances had bought her time, but not safety. If anything, it heightened the tension, revealing just how deeply the seeds of conspiracy had taken root. She knew she would have to strike again, with greater precision and against targets even closer to her. But for the moment, she stood alone in her private chamber, recognizing that she had crossed a threshold from which she could never return. And what waited on the other side was darker, more calculated, and far more dangerous than anything she had imagined. Share your thoughts in the comments about what this kind of hidden power does to a ruler's mind and to everyone around them, and what you think this Empress was becoming as she stepped deeper into the shadows. The walls of the palace began to feel narrower after those first quiet disappearances, as if the structure itself could sense the shift in her intentions. The Empress no longer walked through her own chambers with the certainty of someone in control. She moved with the heightened awareness of a hunter who knows the forest is watching back. In the eye, whispers behind fans, the halted conversations when she entered a room, the sudden stiffness in the posture of court servants. None of it was loud enough to accuse anyone, but every detail added to a growing truth. The opposition had not dissolved. It had simply gone underground. And in the shadows beneath the throne, the most dangerous ideas were taking shape. Her advisors insisted that the palace remained secure, but she knew better. Security meant nothing when the threat came from mines, not swords. That realization drove her to explore parts of the palace rarely visited by royalty. The storage corridors that connected the administrative wing to the old archives, the abandoned servants' quarters sealed after an epidemic decades earlier, even the chambers beneath the temple annex where ritual instruments gathered dust. With each step, she sensed the layers of history that clung to these hidden spaces, memories of interrogations, punishments, and political purges carried out by past rulers. It was here, among forgotten relics, that she found inspiration for her next move. The Empress began restoring several long-abandoned chambers, not for ceremony, but for secrecy. Walls were reinforced. Torches were replaced with oil lamps that cast minimal smoke. Guards with no family ties were reassigned to monitor the corridors at odd hours. These preparations raised questions among the staff, yet no one dared to challenge her. Only a handful of attendants understood the purpose of these new rooms. They were not simple storage areas. They were controlled spaces for extracting information. Rooms where truth could be uncovered without public accusation, where loyalty could be tested and fear could be sharpened into obedience. The first individuals brought into these chambers were not high-ranking ministers, but those who lived closest to power: record keepers, personal attendants, and clerks responsible for copying documents. Their knowledge made them dangerous. Their lack of status made them replaceable. The Empress never witnessed the interrogations directly. She preferred distance. But she read the reports written in coded phrases designed to soothe the conscience of those who delivered them. Clarification obtained. Loyalty confirmed. Risk neutralized. These words carried no detail, yet she understood their meaning too well. Beneath their softness lay nights of whispered questions, dimmed lamps, trembling hands, and the quiet terror of people who realized too late that they had walked into a room meant to erase uncertainty from the throne. Still, even these measures revealed something far more unsettling than disloyalty. Several of those questioned spoke of rumors they had overheard about secret gatherings among the concubines and eunuchs, meetings disguised as informal tea ceremonies or ritual rehearsals. These small groups exchanged not only grievances but information, details about council decisions before they were announced, travel, plans of foreign envoys, even drafts of new laws that had never left the Empress's private desk. The leak was wider than she feared. Someone close to her, perhaps several people, had found a way to access what should have been inaccessible. For the Empress, this discovery was a turning point. Eliminating individuals would no longer be enough. The palace was not suffering from isolated disloyalty. It was suffering from structural corruption. There were hidden corridors of influence, invisible, alliances linking people she had never suspected, and a network of watchers working against her without ever stepping into the light. She realized that unless she controlled the environment itself, its rooms, its rituals, its silences, she would forever be reacting instead of shaping events. And so she prepared herself for a transformation, one that would pull her deeper into a world where trust was an illusion, and every whispered word carried the weight of potential collapse. Once the Empress understood that the palace itself had become a living organism working against her, she shifted her strategy from suppressing threats to cultivating a counterforce that could operate where official authority could not. And the most unexpected resource at her disposal was the silent network of women who had grown invisible precisely because no one saw them as political actors. They were the nurses who tended to noble children, the seamstresses who patched ceremonial robes, the attendants who carried incense during rituals, the readers who recited poems during late-night gatherings. Their presence filtered into every corner of court life, yet they were treated as background scenery rather than individuals with agency. This blindness made them powerful. The Empress began observing these women during ceremonies, noticing which ones moved with intention, which ones listened without being seen, which ones had learned to occupy space without leaving a trail. She invited a select few into private service, not through announcements or promotions, but through small shifts in their duties that signaled trust without drawing attention. One woman who had been tasked with caring for the Empress's jewelry was now instructed to deliver coded messages hidden inside the lining of boxes. Another, who once prepared incense for rituals, learned to observe which ministers changed their prayers depending on who stood beside them. A third, previously responsible for managing tea supplies, was quietly redirected to monitor who arrived early or late to morning audiences. These women moved through the palace like threads woven through fabric, connecting conversations, gathering fragments, watching for patterns others ignored. Their loyalty to the Empress did not come from ambition, but from a deep understanding of their shared vulnerability. If the throne fell, they would be discarded before anyone else. Their survival was tied to hers, and they accepted the unspoken pact with a level of devotion more reliable than that of generals or ministers. As the network grew, the Empress began receiving reports so detailed that they revealed the emotional undercurrents of the palace. The jealousy of a concubine who feared losing influence, the anxiety of a eunuch who had been bribed into silence, the nervous glances exchanged between two ministers who shared a secret alliance. These observations provided the Empress with something far more valuable than evidence. They provided insight into intentions before they solidified into actions. Her attendants learned to interpret hesitation as strategy, politeness as concealment, generosity as manipulation. Over time, their intuition became as sharp as any coded message. But information alone was not enough. To maintain control, the Empress needed her network to influence events, not merely observe them. So she expanded their roles. One attendant began spreading carefully chosen rumors about an upcoming imperial inspection, prompting certain officials to panic and reveal their hidden loyalties. Another subtly redirected a banquet seating arrangement, causing a fragile alliance between rival families to fracture within minutes. A third arranged for priests from a distant temple to be present during a ritual, derailing a covert plan by influential nobles who intended to use the ceremony to elevate their status. These interventions worked because no one suspected the women behind them. They were invisible architects of palace equilibrium, guiding outcomes without ever appearing to touch them. Even the Empress herself avoided acknowledging them publicly, understanding that their power existed precisely because it was unrecognized. And as their influence deepened, the palace began shifting again, this time in her direction. Still, the Empress sensed an approaching storm. The more she tightened her control, the more desperate her enemies became. The network she had built allowed her to shape currents within the palace, but outside its walls, whispers of rebellion continued to spread. And among the reports she received, one detail emerged repeatedly. A specific region, a city where discontent had grown faster than anywhere else. A place where priests, nobles, and soldiers seemed to move with a unity that felt too deliberate to be accidental. It was the first sign that the danger threatening her throne was about to expand beyond the palace gates. The reports about that distant city kept arriving, with an unsettling rhythm, as if carried not by messengers, but by an echo-building momentum across the empire. At first, the details were subtle. A provincial magistrate delaying tax shipments, a minor temple refusing to perform a ritual in the Empress's name, a group of merchants suddenly withholding donations from the Imperial treasury. Each of these actions could have been dismissed as mismanagement or ordinary defiance, but taken together, they signaled something deeper. The city was not just disobedient. It was drifting toward organized dissent, and that made it far more dangerous than any palace whisper. As the Empress read each new report, she began to sense a pattern that felt eerily similar to the one spreading inside the palace. The same coded expressions appeared in documents that should have been written independently. Identical phrasing emerged in letters from different officials. Even travel permits issued to soldiers bore strange markings that did not match standard protocol. Something was binding these people together, a shared intention, a quiet rebellion that had learned from the missteps of failed uprisings. It moved without proclamations, without public speeches, and without leaders bold enough to expose themselves. It was an uprising built on silence, the kind that could grow beneath the surface until it swallowed entire provinces. Her advisors downplayed the threat. They assured her that the region had always been difficult to govern, that its people were proud, stubborn, unpredictable. But the Empress recognized the tone of their reassurances. It was the same tone she had heard from ministers who insisted the palace was stable even as it trembled. She could feel the same invisible pressure, the same tension in the air, a heaviness not born from fear, but from anticipation. Something was coming, something coordinated, and the city at the center of it had become a symbol of collective defiance. To understand its true danger, the Empress summoned her network. Her attendants, those invisible weavers of information, began tracing connections between the city's officials and the palace factions she had been monitoring for months. The links revealed were alarming: nobles with property there, priests who trained in temples known for dissent, soldiers stationed in the region who had relatives within court rival groups. It was not a random cluster of discontent. It was a web of influence spanning from the city streets to the palace corridors. For the first time, the Empress saw the outline of a threat capable of challenging her authority, not by force, but by unity. She understood that if the city continued on this path, it could ignite a chain reaction across the empire. Other regions, waiting for a sign of weakness, would follow. Factions within the palace, emboldened by growing alliances, would act. And the empire's fragile balance, held together by ceremonies, rituals, and the perception of stability, would collapse with terrifying speed. The Empress felt the weight of that possibility pressing against her chest, a cold reminder that hesitation could be catastrophic. She had silenced individuals before. Now she faced the unimaginable, the possibility of having to silence an entire city. As she walked through her private chamber that night, lamps flickering across carved wooden panels, she knew her next decision would shape the empire's future. The question was no longer whether she should act, but how far she was willing to go to preserve a throne built on fragile obedience. And for the first time, she considered a command so severe that even her most loyal attendants might hesitate to carry it out, a decree that would never be written, never spoken publicly, but whose consequences would echo through generations. Tell me in the comments what you think pushed a ruler to consider a decision of such magnitude, and how you believe power mutates when fear and loyalty begin to merge into the same force. The Empress did not sleep the night she first contemplated the unspoken order. The flicker of the oil lamps cast shifting patterns across the room, and for hours she sat motionless, listening to the soft creak of the palace settling in the cold darkness. She knew that if she issued a command against the city, even in secret, the consequences would ripple through the empire with a force she could never fully control. Yet the silence outside her chamber felt dangerous, like the breath held before. A storm breaks. She had faced conspirators, ministers, concubines, foreign envoys, individuals who moved in shadows. But this was different. A city could not be interrogated, persuaded, or quietly removed. It was a living mass of belief, resentment, memory, and ambition. At dawn, she decided she needed clarity before taking action. She summoned her most trusted attendant, a woman who had proven capable of walking through danger as if it were nothing more than smoke. Without leaving any trace of Imperial involvement, this attendant traveled toward the rebellious region, disguised among merchants and temple pilgrims. The journey itself was a test. If the city had truly become a hub of coordinated resistance, travelers would speak of it in hushed tones long before its walls came into view. And they did. Rumors moved faster than merchants' carts. People whispered about officials ignoring imperial orders, about priests preaching cryptic warnings involving the fate of the throne, about soldiers training at night without permission from the capital. These stories were woven together with alarming consistency. By the time the attendant reached the city, the Empress's worst fears were confirmed. The city was not simply disobedient, it had transformed. Its marketplaces felt charged with unspoken tension. Its officials carried themselves with a confidence rarely seen in provincial administrators. The temples, usually aligned with imperial authority, hosted gatherings that felt more like councils than religious ceremonies. The soldiers stationed there appeared unusually disciplined, as if preparing for something beyond routine patrols. Even the common people, who should have feared punishment, walked with a boldness that suggested belief in protection from forces greater than the Empress. What disturbed the attendant most were the subtle symbols carved into doorframes and painted beneath eaves, marks that were not part of any sanctioned ritual. They appeared unified, deliberate, and secretive, as if representing an agreement shared only among the city's leaders. When she returned to the capital weeks later, pale and shaken, she brought not only her observations, but also fragments of overheard discussions, whispers of an oath, mentions of cleansing, references to a shift in destiny that would begin in that very city. It became clear that the rebellion was not merely political. It carried religious undertones, ideological fervor capable of igniting passions beyond logic. The Empress listened to every word without interruption. As the attendant spoke, the truth unfolded with chilling clarity. The city's defiance had evolved into a movement, one that stretched from temples to barracks to households. It was a living organism with its own pulse, its own momentum, and perhaps its own prophecy. And like all movements born in silence, it had the power to spread before anyone realized it was too late. What the Empress did next was not recorded in any official chronicle. There were no decrees, no proclamations, no council meetings. Only a long moment of stillness before she dismissed everyone except her most loyal attendants. The decision had formed inside her, heavy and inevitable, shaped by months of watching enemies multiply in the shadows. She understood that this city was not merely challenging her authority, it was challenging the foundation upon which the empire stood. If she hesitated now, the future would not belong to her bloodline or her legacy. It would belong to those who believed they could dictate destiny from outside the palace walls. By the end of that night, the Empress stood before a threshold she could no longer avoid, ready to step into a darkness that even her predecessors had feared to enter. When dawn rose after that long night, the Empress no longer looked like a ruler wrestling with uncertainty. Something within her had settled, not into peace, but into direction. The city's silent rebellion had crossed from rumor into inevitability, and she understood what historians often forget. Power is not lost in a single moment. It erodes. It decays through hesitation, through doubt, through the quiet confidence of those who believe the ruler has grown afraid to act. In her mind, hesitation had become a luxury she could no longer afford. And so she sought answers in the only place where truth remained unfiltered, records untouched by political revision. Deep inside the palace existed a restricted archive, accessible only to sovereigns. Few rulers visited it, because the scrolls and tablets stored there held accounts not of glory, but of failures. Dynasties toppled by complacency, rebellions born from ignored warnings, catastrophes unleashed by rulers who acted too late. The Empress descended into this archive alone, carrying a single lantern. Dust coated the shelves like a second skin, and the air smelled of age so old it felt like memory itself. She read accounts of provinces that rose against weak emperors, of cities that disguised sedition with ritual, of rulers who placed faith in councils that betrayed them in the end. Each line seemed to reflect her own situation with eerie accuracy, as if history were whispering that she now stood at the same precipice. But among the archives, she found something stranger, a set of entries written in a different hand, each recounting actions taken by previous rulers that never appeared in official histories. These hidden texts described secret purges, covert relocations of entire families, and orders issued in absolute silence to extinguish threats before they blossomed. The tone was cold, yet not cruel. It was the tone of sovereigns who believed they bore a burden no one else could understand. As she read them, the Empress recognized a pattern that echoed her own reasoning. Every ruler who preserved stability in times of fracture had eventually resorted to measures the public was never meant to know. This discovery did not comfort her, it burdened her. It showed that the path she contemplated was not unprecedented. It was cyclical, woven into the empire's survival. The weight of legacy, of expectation, of the throne itself pressed against her chest like a tightening band. For a moment, she wondered whether she was becoming the very figure she once feared, a ruler shaped by shadows rather than light. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it emerged. The city's rebellion was accelerating. Time was dissolving around her. And she could feel the empire's equilibrium bending like a wooden beam under too much pressure. Returning to her private chambers, she summoned astrologers, not for divination, but for interpretation. The celestial charts they produced revealed a disturbing pattern of converging omens. One astrologer, trembling, whispered that the empire had entered a cycle historically associated with the reshaping of destiny through sacrifice. Another noted that the alignment mirrored that of an era in which a previous ruler had taken drastic secret action against a provincial uprising. None of these interpretations told her what to do, but they confirmed one thing. The current moment was charged with historical gravity. Her next action would not simply influence the empire, it would define it. At the same time, foreign envoys began sending cryptic inquiries. They had heard rumors, how, no one knew, about rising instability and shifting loyalties within the capital. Their letters were disguised as diplomatic formalities, but each sentence carried a deeper message. The empire's external enemies were watching closely. A ruler hesitating at such a time would invite intervention, exploitation, or invasion. The Empress realized that her decision regarding the rebellious city would not only determine internal stability, but would also signal to the world whether the empire remained formidable or had begun to fracture. All of these threads tightened around her until she reached a single, unavoidable conclusion. Something had to be done swiftly, decisively, and silently. Not publicly, not through ceremony, not through decrees that could be questioned or resisted. What she contemplated required secrecy so absolute that even those who carried out the task might not fully understand the magnitude of what they were doing. And as she prepared herself for the final step, a step darker and more consequential than anything she had ordered before, she found herself standing on the edge of a decision that would haunt the empire long after her name faded from memory. When the final decision formed inside her, it did not strike like lightning. It arrived slowly, with the cold certainty of something that had been waiting for her to acknowledge it. The Empress stood in her private chamber long after the palace had fallen silent, her fingers resting lightly on the carved wood of a ceremonial screen. The city had crossed a line no ruler could ignore. Its unity, its coded rituals, its subtle defiance. Everything pointed to a force that would grow bolder with each passing day. She had watched conspiracies blossom in the palace. She had seen alliances take shape beneath polite smiles. She knew how quickly unrest could spread when allowed to breathe. And now, an entire city was exhaling rebellion. There was no decree, no announcement, no council meeting. Instead, she summoned 3 attendants at dawn, the same women who had shadowed her rise with unwavering loyalty. They were given instructions so fragmented that none of them could fully understand the whole plan. One was told to deliver sealed messages to military outposts along a seldom-used mountain route. Another was ordered to reroute supply caravans that fed the rebellious region. The third was sent to temples with offerings meant to mask her true intentions. Each command seemed harmless when isolated. But together, they formed the spine of a silent operation designed to seal the city's fate without ever exposing the Empress's hand. As the days unfolded, the operation began to move like a tightening circle. Roads were blocked under the pretext of repairing damage from recent storms. Merchant caravans were delayed due to unexpected inspections. Temple rituals were altered, disrupting the schedule that connected the region's spiritual life. The city's lifelines shrank quietly, almost elegantly, as if the empire were drawing a breath inward. And then came the moment no one in the city could escape: the sudden arrival of loyal regiments under the guise of routine patrol. They positioned themselves not as aggressors, but as guardians seeking to protect the region. In reality, they formed an unbreakable ring. What happened next would never be recorded in official documents. There were no dramatic battles or flaming banners. Instead, the city was suffocated from within. Key figures were removed without noise. Influential priests vanished during midnight rituals, and soldiers loyal to the conspiracy found themselves reassigned so far away they might as well have been exiled. Families known for funding dissent were quietly relocated. Storehouses were inspected and sealed. Information stopped flowing. Rumors dried up. And the once confident city began to unravel under the weight of a silence it could not understand. To the outside world, nothing happened. There were no proclamations of punishment, no accusations, no visible scars. The Empress appeared calm during ceremonies, serene as ever. But inside the walls of the silenced city, the message was clear. Rebellion could be born in whispers, but it could also die in them. The empire continued forward, its surface undisturbed, while beneath it lingered the memory of what had been erased. Historians would later puzzle over how the city's influence faded so suddenly, why its leaders disappeared from records, why its temples stopped producing notable scholars. They speculated about disease, migration, famine, anything but the truth. That it had been reshaped by a command powerful enough to destroy without announcing itself. And those who dug deeper, those who read between censored lines, sensed an invisible hand guiding the empire's fate in that era. A hand that bore the Empress's quiet strength, her cold clarity, and her unbreakable will to safeguard a throne no one believed she could hold. If you are still here, following her journey through shadows and silent decisions, let me know in the comments by writing the phrase "I am with you" until the end. It helps me understand who truly connects with this kind of hidden history. And if you felt the weight of this story, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next descent into the darker corners of the past. A like also tells me this kind of deep narrative matters to you. There is another video waiting right here beside this one, a continuation of these forgotten truths. Click and come with me. There is much more buried beneath the surface.